So, beginning nationally, in Tuesday's speech, Obama made proposals for an economic recovery program covering jobs, healthcare, education, the environment, much more. What is the context in which to understand these proposals?
Well, one context, which is part of the context which is obvious, is that there is a very severe financial crisis. And there's also a manufacturing recession, and it's global. Its roots are here, but it's global, and in fact, much of the rest of the world is in worse shape, including Europe. So it's a major crisis. Nobody knows how far it's going to go. It's certainly the worst since the Great Depression, and a lot is uncertain. It's not really understood. That's a consequence of the financialization of the economy and the kind of the mystical faith in somehow markets will, what's called the efficient market hypothesis. Somehow everything will work out because markets have miracles. There were obvious reasons why this is not going to work. There have been crises all over the world since the financialization of the economy in the 70s. So far they've been either in poor countries where, who cares, or somehow containable, like long-term management. But and now it's hit home in a way that matters. And it's incidentally quite striking to see the difference between this radical difference between the measures that the rich use for themselves and the measures that they use for the poor. So when Indonesia has a financial crisis, a horrible crisis as it did 10 years ago, the rules from the Treasury Department via the IMF are pay back your debt, namely to us, raise interest rates, slow down the economic growth, suffer, which is structural adjustment, privatize, because now we got a chance to take over everything. And in fact, those are still the rules that the IMF is giving to the poor. For ourselves, it's the precise opposite. Stimulate the economy, forget about debt, just go into as much debt as you want. Try to encourage China and others to pay us more, which is what Clinton just did on her last trip. Nationalize, don't call it nationalize, but essentially nationalize instead of privatize, pour money into the economy to get it working again. And right down the line, the precise opposite. And it's interesting that in a way, it's not surprising. The rich take care of themselves. That's economic history, and kick everybody else in the face. But it's kind of striking that it can go on right in front of you, and it's as if nobody notices, But anyway, that's one part of the crisis. The other part is, which is related, is we've come out of 30 years of, by many measures, the worst period of U.S. economic history for the majority of the population. It's a very rich country, so, people don't starve the way they do in India. But, it's been 30 years in which real wages adjusted for inflation, have pretty much stagnated for the majority, sometimes declined. Benefits have declined. Quality of life standards have declined. The U.S. is one of the maybe the only or the very few industrial countries that does not keep statistics on what are called social indicators. How's the society doing? Infant mortality, child abuse, a whole pile of things. Other even Turkey keeps statistics, but the U.S. doesn't. However, there are some that are kept. There are efforts to keep them. Fordham University is one place where they've been doing it, and it turns out that they started in about 1960, and from 1960 to 1975, roughly, indicators improved, and they tracked growth, which is what you'd expect. As growth goes up, social conditions get better. Since 1975, they've declined, and the last ones that were published around 2000 was back to 1960, and that's a measure in the general decline of conditions and circumstances for the majority of the population. There has been growth, not as fast as before, but it's into very few pockets. So it's ended up with tremendous inequality. This is related to the financialization of the economy. When you pour huge amounts of capital into speculation against currencies, very short-term transactions and so on. First of all, it takes money out of the working economy, and it also requires countries to protect themselves against speculative attack, to store up big reserves and so on and so forth. So in general, it's kind of been a drag on economic growth. This is sort of muddled in the discussion because there are a few countries, East Asia and China, which have basically disregarded the rules, and they've grown substantially. So if you throw in 1 billion Chinese into the total statistics, looks like there's been very good growth, And commentators, including, unfortunately, economists, often muddle export orientation with following the neoliberal rules. And so China grew fast by violating the rules and exporting. So it you can say, well, what's called globalization works. Look at the average for the world. But if you sort of disaggregate it and you see who's growing and how and why, it turns out it's mostly been a kind of a catastrophe for everyone except the very rich. So that's another part of the context. Well, in that, and of course the Bush years have been like a total catastrophe on every front. You get to see it in the election. I mean, even his own party ran against him, which is pretty unusual. So yes, it was clear that whoever came in, maybe Obama a little more than McCain, but whoever came in would have to move away from the extreme radicalism of the Cheney-Bush administration, to give the right order to the names, because it's just too much of a catastrophe for major American interests. That's why you got huge funding for Obama from the financial industries and others, because they just let's get rid of this. In fact, more for Obama than McCain. They figured he's their man. So inevitably there was going to be a shift back towards the center. Now, you really can't I mean, a lot of people are disappointed in Obama, but that's really unfair. He never gave any indication that he was anything but a familiar centrist Democrat. And that's which means a little more favorable to the population on domestic policies, but hawkish on international affairs. And that's pretty much what you find. The budget that you have here in today's New York Times.
Right, the $634 billion in health care and $140 for war just this year on Iraq and Afghanistan.
But it
how we
fits
measure
that pattern, and it's also, I mean, it's, by and large, given the circumstances and the constraints in his own positions, it's not a bad budget. Like Paul Krugman has an article in here in which he applauds it, and it's more or less accurate. I think it's general. It's not, I don't think it makes sense to call it a progressive budget. It's a move back towards the center after a radical departure to the right, which actually goes back to the late Carter years, but sort of accelerated with Reagan, was carried on by Clinton in a different way, and went off to catastrophe under Bush. So yes, there's got to be some dealing with these catastrophes on all fronts, and it is a move towards the center, and in that sense is welcome. That's better than the radical right. But if you really look into, I mean, he wasn't very specific, which is what you'd expect. The specifics will come when they work it out. But the general outlines have important characteristics. Like one of the main foci was healthcare, as it must be, because healthcare is, it's like a disaster. It costs, the U.S. spends about twice per capita, twice as much per capita as other industrial countries. It has some of the worst outcomes. That's a huge drag on the economy, and except for the ones who benefit, like the insurance companies, the pharmaceutical companies. But it's a drag for manufacturing industry. In fact, one of the interesting things about the election, as compared with 2004, is that in 2004, as in earlier elections, the standard line in the New York Times, for example, was that the Democratic candidate couldn't bring up any government involvement in health care because it had no political support, meaning a large majority of the population wants it, has wanted it for decades, but that's not political support in our system. The pharmaceutical corporations were opposed, and the insurance industry was opposed, the financial industries, so no political support. In this campaign, 2008, actually for the first time, first Edwards, and after Obama and Clinton, made some moves towards what the public has wanted for decades, namely a national single-payer healthcare system, like pretty much like other countries have. I mean, here it's called Canadian style because we know that Canada's there. It's hard to miss. It's not called Australian style, though they have a better system because where's Australia? But it's what the population's wanted for decades, but it was never politically possible. Now it is. What happened between 2004 and 2008? Well, no change in popular opinion that anyone knows, but there is a change in the sector of the country that matters, concentrated capital. Manufacturing industry is being harmed significantly by the highly inefficient healthcare system. So General Motors says, produce cars much more cheaply in Windsor, Canada than Detroit because, they have a semi-sensible healthcare system. So when you have a big sector of American capital, pushing for something, it begins to have political support. So there are moves towards dealing with the healthcare problem, not the way the population wants, but in that direction. Now that's pretty clear in his, Obama purposely pretty vague, it doesn't say much, but there are hints. And what he says is he wants to do something to extend health, to deal with the fact that like 50 million people don't have insurance. And many of the rest are underinsured, which is a very severe problem. But it's not the core of the problem. The core of the problem is the two things: the extreme inefficiency of the privatized system and the huge benefits given to the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, this is, I think, the only industrial country where, by law, the government is not allowed to negotiate prices for the government-run part of the system, Medicare, and so. Like the Pentagon can negotiate, use its purchasing power to negotiate for paper clips or something, but the government can't negotiate drug prices using its huge purchasing power. Well, that alone shoots drug prices way up to the stratosphere. They're also shot up further by the highly protectionist provisions of the World Trade Organization. It's called free trade, but it's nothing like that. And a large part of the protectionism is to make sure that pharmaceutical companies have monopoly pricing rights. They claim it's for research and development, but an analysis shows that's not true. Dean Baker, as one economist who studied it, points out correctly that if most of their funding for research and development doesn't come from internally anyway, it's either from the government or from foundations. And if you increased R&D spending, if you decreased it internally to zero, and they were forced on the market, it'd be a huge saving to consumers, but that doesn't give them enough profits. Also, their own R&D is mostly toward the marketing side, copycat drugs and so on. And even this is an underestimate because it doesn't count fundamental biological work, like what they do in the biology department here, which is at all public expense. So that's mostly a scam, but this is one big component of the healthcare problem. The other big component is the privatization with huge administrative costs and bureaucracy and supervision and so on and so forth, far higher than public systems. But there's no mention of any of this. I mean, there's a tiny mention, to be precise. Obama did talk in the budget about a reduction of the Medicare payments to private insurers that that give care out of Medicare, which was another scam put in by the bill that was passed a couple of years ago. So he talks about reducing that. Okay, that's a slight barrier to privatization of the system, but this skirts the edges, and it means that the healthcare costs, which are going to overwhelm the federal budget if this continues, are really not dealt with. And it's why people talk about, well, we'll need more resources to cover the healthcare reform. Well, that's true if you leave it as is and you try to extend it to everyone. But it isn't true if you institute the kind of program that the population has, the majority has wanted for decades. And that's all kind of off the agenda. A usual way of describing this, and Obama does too, is to say that it's an entitlements problem. So it's a problem of Social Security and Medicare. But that's highly misleading. I mean, it's almost entirely Medicare. The part that Social Security is minuscule in comparison. In fact, Social Security is very efficient. There's a little bureaucracy, administrative costs, and it's fully funded for decades ahead, and after that probably requires really minor adjustments to be viable indefinitely. It's probably in as good shape now as it's ever been. But these things are bundled together as part of an attack on Social Security. And there are powerful forces trying to destroy Social Security. I mean, the Peterson Institute is, at the forefront, but plenty of others. And there's kind of a gesture to the attack on Social Security in the Obama program, namely when he talks about setting up government-backed, tax-free private personal funds for retirement. Okay, that's a way to chip away at Social Security. And Social Security is, the population loves it, but elites don't like it at all for a lot of reasons. Some of them just ideological. I mean, for one thing, it mostly goes to the wrong people, namely needy people. That's not the way things are supposed to work. You're supposed to help the rich. But also, it's just ideologically wrong. Social Security is based on the principle that you care about other people. Like, you care whether, the widow across town has food or a disabled person can survive. And that's dangerous. When you have notions of community responsibility and solidarity, that chips away at subordination to concentrated power. So it's kind of like it sticks out ideologically as something that's kind of inconsistent with power structures. And so there's constant efforts to attack it, and unfortunately Obama's sort of going along with this a little.
I wanted to ask about what we can anticipate from elites. On the one hand, Obama's trying to save the system from crisis. On the other hand, it does entail some redistribution of wealth.
Does, yeah.
He had the proposed tax, rolling back of tax for the higher income. And
good article about it in the Wall Street Journal yesterday. If you want to deal with the deficit, that's one aspect of this. It's delayed, but you want to deal with it. There are two major sectors that in which you have to focus. One is the healthcare system, as we've discussed, and that's being skirted. In fact, the proposals are going to increase the deficit. The other is the military system, which is huge. Obama's if you look at the budget, it again skirts that. Now, there is a suggestion, namely that we move away from by and large high-tech advanced weapons to fight the Martians or something. They have no real function. There's some talk about China, but that's completely meaningless. We should move away from that to intervention forces. Okay, they really have a function. Like, you can invade Afghanistan and use them wherever you want. And there's a shift in that direction. So we must increase those. Now, I don't exactly know what the cost estimates are, but there's unlikely to be a cost saving there, though there is support for the generally hawkish stand with regard to intervention. So those two major components that'll have to be dealt with if there's going to be any reduction to the deficit are just kind of sidelined. There is another part of the budget is an attempt to slightly reduce the grotesque inequality that's developed in the last 30 years. And that's fiscal, so the tax system is modified. That's one way to do it, but it's, again, chipping away at the edges. The main way to overcome inequality is to allow workers to organize, as most of the workforce wants to do. When people can organize, they can struggle for higher wages, for better benefits, and you look at the record, you see it works. So that's, and it's also a contribution to democracy. If you have unions, people are not isolated. They can work together. They can enter the political arena in some fashion, facing concentrated capital. Well, there is a measure, the Employee Free Choice Act, which is badly misdescribed in most of the public commentary. It's basically a way for workers to decide whether there should be union organizing, not allowing employers to decide. And that was brought up in the campaign, but there's nothing about it since Obama was elected. When his chief of staff has been asked a couple of times, he kind of sidesteps it, says, well, it's on the agenda later on. However, if you really want to attack inequality and extend rights and in fact even extend democracy, that should be the top of the agenda. That's not in there. So in general, it's a move back toward the center from the extreme right and is progressive in that sense, but I think it's skirting the main problems.
Let's shift to look at an international focus. And I wanted to look at Afghanistan and Iraq and Pakistan, but beginning with Obama's recent proposal on withdrawal, or his discussion of withdrawal.
There's a very striking feature of the whole debate about withdrawal. I mean, it is being debated, like Nancy Pelosi doesn't like it, and somebody else does like it, and somebody else says it's too fast. There's one voice missing, Iraqis. I mean, does anybody say what Iraqis want? No, we know what they want. They compelled the United States to accept the status of forces agreement, which the U.S. didn't want. It struggled all the way to prevent it, just as it has struggled all the way to prevent any form of democracy in Iraq. I mean, the U.S. tried to prevent elections. When it was forced to accept elections, it tried to subvert them, succeeded to an extent, but not completely. In fact, when the SOFA, Status of Forces Agreement, was being debated, the commentary in the press was quite intriguing. What was said standardly is that al-Maliki, who they hoped was our man, is giving in to popular pressure. He doesn't really mean it. You know, he's forced to appease the public when he says you have to have a timetable. But of course, he doesn't really mean it. That's an interesting concept. Like, suppose he was responding to popular pressure. That's bad. You know, I mean, the hatred of democracy is so intense and deeply rooted that it's taken for granted that if a political leader is responding to the public and not to us, there's something wrong, and maybe he doesn't really mean it, so we can go on. But he did mean it. And finally, I guess it was about November 2007, the Bush administration laid out its conception of the Status of Forces Agreement, which was, you know, permanent bases, give priority to American corporations and oil development, exploration, series of measures. They're all out of the SOFA. The U.S. had to agree. Now, what actually happened, I think, is that there's been a tremendous victory for nonviolent mass resistance for the last 6 years. A significant victory. I mean, the U.S. could kill insurgents, but couldn't deal with hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. And therefore, step by step, it's backed off. Now, of course, this is going to be is interpreted as a great victory. But on the contrary, it means giving up the war aims. And Obama is trying to sustain them. To keep 50,000 troops there means to keep an occupation. 50,000, you count logistics and so on. You know, pretty soon you got 100,000, and then try to hang on to what you can. But Iraqis have been very explicit about this. Now, maybe you can sort of beat leadership over the head so they'll say they're going along. In other words, disregard public opinion. But that's what the real debate should be about. And in fact, we should be saying nothing about the rate of withdrawal. It's not the role of the aggressors to decide when to withdraw. When the Russians invaded Afghanistan, we didn't suggest it's their decision. Should they withdraw fast? Should they withdraw slow? You know, they leave 50,000 troops there. I mean, they have no business being there. Okay, so get out. But when it's us, since tacitly we own the world, we decide. And Iraqis literally are not mentioned. Read the discussion, it's not there. So yes, there's discussion among sectors of power in the United States as to try to finesse the demand of Iraqis so that we can still get what we want. And it's extremely interesting to see the way this is put. I guess maybe yesterday or 2 days ago, the Times had they have a kind of a monthly report from Iraq by two leading specialists, Michael O'Hanlon and Kenneth Pollack, and they had their big report. And they were warning that the situation in Iraq is very unstable and it's of enormous strategic importance, all of which is correct. The truth is sort of leaking out. You can't talk about, the fake war aims anymore. And they happen to say on the side that if Iraq collapses into chaos, it will be hard to pressure Jordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia to make the hard decisions required to accept peace with Israel. Now that's a very intriguing example of how ideological fanaticism with constant media and public reiteration can completely invert the truth with nobody noticing. I mean, there's no problem getting Jordan, Syria, and Saudi Arabia to agree. They agreed 30 years ago. I mean, the U.S. in fact had to veto a Security Council resolution back in 1976 that they introduced, calling for a two-state settlement on the international border, and it's up to the present. It's the U.S. that's blocking it, and has been for over 30 years. Obama himself has made it explicit that he continues to block it. But facts are just irrelevant in an atmosphere of religious fanaticism. The religion here is just state worship. So it must be somebody else who's causing the problems, even if the facts are so crystal clear in this case. They could hardly be clearer in a complex situation, but it's inverted. Going back to the withdrawal from Iraq, whatever you think of the elected Iraqi government, they're missing, and the same is true in Afghanistan. I mean, recently there's been very harsh criticism in the press of Karzai, President Karzai. Why? Is he different than he was 2 years ago when he was a hero? Well, yeah, he's different in two crucial respects. First of all, his first message to Obama, which as far as I know remains unanswered, is that the U.S. should stop killing Afghan civilians. Well, that's not appropriate. But his second statement was even worse. He called for a timetable for withdrawal of foreign troops. Well, now we're getting really intolerable. So he's now a bad guy. We've got to do something about him, bypass him, and so on. But that's true. That's his position. We don't exactly know the details about public opinion in Afghanistan, but it very likely is public opinion to the extent that we know. There's a substantial peace movement in Afghanistan. It's had conferences, jirgas, brings together large segments of the population, and they're basically calling for an end to violence and a move towards diplomacy. They're not opposed to having outside forces there if they're there for reconstruction, not destruction, which is quite a big difference. Even in the mainstream, like Foreign Affairs, the establishment journal, you can read harsh critique of the idea that we have to aim for military victory and recognition that it's going to have to involve internal reconciliation, meaning with the Taliban, which is what a large majority of the population want, according to Western-run polls, and also regional involvement, meaning Iran, Russia, India, and so on, all of China, all of which have interests, and that's what's recommended by specialists like happens to be Barnett Rubin and Ahmed Rashid in this case, but many others. Well, Obama's going the opposite direction, military victory, increasing military force. And again, Afghan voices, though not unknown, are not part of this discussion. So in this sense, it's like Iraq. Now, of course, Afghanistan spills over right away into Pakistan. In fact, the distinction between them is just, imperial decisions. I mean, the British, when they were running the place, Pakistan is then part of India, they drew an artificial line, the Durand line, right through the middle of Pashtun territory. These are tribal areas, and the big tribe is the Pashtuns. And the Durand line just goes right through the middle, So now one side is Pakistan, the other side is Afghanistan, but it's of no interest to them. They're the same people. It's as if some foreign power drew a line between, right down the middle of Massachusetts and said, okay, you stay on this side, we'll run the other side. That's the way they look at it. So there, in these so-called tribal areas, there's constant interaction, and if resistance forces are smashed in the Afghanistan side, of course it'll all come from the other side, just as under the Russians. I mean, under the Russians, Peshawar, the main city up on the Pakistan side, was the center of the CIA-backed operations that were gathering radical Islamists from all over the world to try to kill as many Russians as possible. And it was open at that time, in fact considered noble, because after all we're doing it. So if we support Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Reagan's favorite, who gets his kicks out of throwing acid in the face of women who are allowed to walk on the streets, okay, that's great, we're fighting for liberation. Now, on the other side of the border, you're still getting support for resistance inside Afghanistan. And Obama's measures are the same. Kill, So send drones to kill people. And it has effects. So the main fighting recently has been in one province, Bajar province, which sort of fell out of control of the Pakistani army. You probably don't care that much and want to get out anyway. But it appears from what the few things we know about it that it may have been instigated largely by a drone attack. There was a drone attack under Bush which hit a madrasa, school, and killed 80 to 85 people. That didn't make the news here, who cares? But it did in Pakistan. And of course, in the regions they know. So yes, and that's exactly what specialists predict. You can sit in California or Las Vegas or whatever it is and send a drone to bomb people, but you're inevitably going to kill civilians, and it's inevitably going to build up resistance and opposition. In fact, opposition to U.S. actions in Pakistan, public opposition is overwhelming. I mean, the government is sort of bludgeoned into, saying, well, okay, we'll look the other way, but that's overruling the population. And in fact, our man in Pakistan, the current president, is taking steps which are going to cause real chaos. His Supreme Court, he refuses to allow the old Chief Justice to come back, because if he does, it will be probably tried for corruption. And his main rival, Nawaz Sharif, his own court has just ruled him ineligible for running for office, and he's got more support than Zardari has, especially in the Punjabi areas, which are the main areas. So there's all kind of protests going on there. There's insurgency in Balochistan. I mean, the whole place is kind of on the verge of collapse, and a very dangerous place. Nuclear weapons, strategic importance, and so on. But the use of force, I mean, a lot of this is the fault of the Reagan administration, who the Russians were trying to withdraw from Afghanistan. We now know that from internal records. But the Reagan administration wanted them in, as did Brzezinski, who was like the super hawk from Carter, and he takes pride in the claim that they set a trap for them and drew them in under Carter. Well, maybe not. But he and the so-called Team B, the group of hawks, Richard Pearl, Richard Pipes, these guys, they wanted the Russians to stay in. And they said why. I mean, the CIA chief in Pakistan said, we want to kill Russians. So let them stay in. If it destroys Afghanistan, none of our business. Meanwhile, Reagan supported the brutal dictator in Pakistan, Zia-ul-Haq, who introduced radical Islamization through the country with Saudi funds. Schools where you don't teach anything but the Quran and so on and so forth. That's a lot of the source of the current radical Islamic-based terror. A lot of it traces right back to Ronald Reagan, and whoever was making the decisions in his administration thought this is great. It tears up Pakistan, destroys it, but Afghanistan, but the side issue. Well, okay, now it's there. You can't and you got to deal with it somehow. And the rational way to deal with it, I think, is the way, say, Rubin and Rashid suggest. That's not a radical position. This is foreign affairs, after all, the main establishment journal. And the way Afghans appear to want, from what we know, internal reconciliation moves and diplomatic initiatives with the surrounding countries, which of course crucially includes Iran, which has very close relations with the sections of Afghanistan that border on it, and has actually helped undermine the Taliban because they hate them, but of course the U.S. is trying to isolate Iran. Obama's continuing with that. So I think it's a prescription for another catastrophe, very likely. It's very likely going to escalate and has nowhere particular to go. That's the centerpiece of foreign policy. As far as the other crucial issue in the Middle East, Israel-Palestine, is concerned, Obama has made it very clear that he does not want to switch from U.S. rejectionism. He made it so clear it takes real genius to overlook it. So again, if you read commentary, there's discussion of how conciliatory he was. He has made one foreign policy declaration, namely when he announced the appointment of George Mitchell as emissary, and it's a good appointment if Mitchell has any leeway. But he made it very clear what his policy is. He's praised for having brought up the Saudi plan favorably, the Arab League plan. But he was very careful the way he brought it up. The Arab League plan calls for a two-state settlement in accord with the international consensus, exactly what they've held for decades. And in that context, it says, okay, we'd even move on to normalization of relations with Israel. Obama brought up the Saudi plan, congratulated the Arab League for accepting it, and then urged the Arab states to move on to normalization of relations with Israel. In other words, eviscerating the plan, eliminating its contents, and just talking about a corollary. Well, how clear can you be? What he's saying is, he's an intelligent person, picks his words carefully, so he and his speechwriters doubtless are saying we're not going to accept the Arab League plan, the international consensus. We would like you to normalize relations with Israel, period. In fact, you can see that again in today's New York Times. There's an article by Ethan Bronner, who I don't regard him as a serious reporter. He's practically parrots Israel's line most of the time. But it's a laudatory report on the training of Palestinian officers in Jordan, headed by a U.S. general and with U.S. funding, and there's a big picture of them, rappelling up a building or something. If you read the article carefully, he does mention that the one thing that these Palestinian forces have done is prevent demonstrations in the West Bank in support of Gazans when they were being slaughtered by the U.S.-backed invasion. Yeah, that's their role. They're being trained to be a collaborationist force which will suppress the Palestinians in the West Bank, ensure that the U.S. chosen figures will stay in power and that Israel will be able to continue to do what it likes. In fact, he even mentions there that an Israeli officer fired the first gun in one of their demonstrations of what progress they've made. Same steps. Let's continue. These are the forces that Bush tried to organize to carry out a military coup in Gaza. Well, they were beaten back. Hamas beat them back. But crucially, we cannot accept the results of the democratic election, one of the few democratic elections in the Arab world, maybe the most free, instantly led to punishment by the U.S. and Israel, again, a reflection of the extreme distaste for democracy, unless it comes out the right way, in which case it's okay. And now it continues. We continue to try to create a paramilitary force which will somehow overcome the results of a democratic election. And that's hailed as a great step towards peace. I mean, Again, like I say, it takes really genius not to see what's happening.